am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire!
Well, Darts Aloud listeners, after hearing that, I think you know what the subject is going to be about today. And so, yeah, we are going to talk about hellfire and all about its history, its meaning, its place in the church, theology. It's going to be a really interesting subject. It's actually a very interesting subject, and it's a very serious one, but it can actually spawn a lot of humor about it. And so, because it's, in one sense, it's such a crazy notion to some people and whatever. So we're going to have a really good look into the subject of hell today. But before that, Ed or Francis, what's the news?
Well, the Unbelievable Show, which of course we are very keen on and listen to pretty avidly, has had a very interesting debate between Greg Boyd and William Lane Craig, well-known people for, I would imagine, for our listeners. And they were going for it on penal substitution and other ways of understanding why Jesus died for sins and how it all works. Now, this is something, of course, we covered right back in episode 5 and 6 and 7, our Summer of Atonement. I think we had it. I'm afraid, folks, we're probably now in the season of hell.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. It's just a season, folks. Just a season.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we haven't got the Christmas season, I'm afraid, in the way. Yeah. Well, we. Yeah.
Except, of course, you all know the Christmas season is a season of hell. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's salvation from the season of hell this year.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, okay. Anyway, so Francis responding back in episode 5 to William Lane Craig, trying to do his thing, which is to rationally explain why the atonement makes sense, particularly his version of the penal substitution take on it. And there, she was talking about his use of employer's liability. So if an employee commits a crime that causes a customer to be injured, the employer is liable even if they are not guilty of anything.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there, because it's not quite that. It's not quite that. The main use that's made and the big part that this concept of vicarious liability plays in the law is not about crime. It's about a part of law called tort, and tort is about wrongdoing that isn't necessarily criminal, but where somebody loses something. So, for instance, if I don't know, my house is, I invite you into my house and the staircase is unsafe, and you go up the staircase and the staircase collapses and you lose one of your legs, say, let's take an extreme example. Then that's a tort by me, and and you can sue me. And the idea is that if what causes the injury to somebody or causes the loss to somebody is some work that has been done on behalf of an employer by an employee, then you'll be equally liable. So if, for instance, you're going into somebody's house which is being built by a builder because you're planning to buy the house, or, for whatever reason, or because you're a surveyor and you've been asked to come and look at the house, and the staircase collapses because the person employed by the builder didn't do a good job on the staircase, then vicarious liability says that was the job that the builder was doing for you on your behalf, and therefore you are responsible. You have to take responsibility for the fact that somebody you employed did a rubbish job, and as a result, a third party got hurt and suffered damage. So we're not going to bother about suing the the builder who put in your employee who put in the staircase, because he's probably not worth a stack of beans in any event. We're going to sue you, Mr. Builder. You're the one who's got the money. You're the one who decided to use this employee, who then got everything so they went pear-shaped. And so you must take the financial responsibility and cough up financially for your employee's wrongdoing. And you can see the sense of that on several levels. Not just the fact that the builder is more likely to be able to pay, but also just sort of philosophically that if you are going to take the benefit, if you as the builder are going to take the benefit of not going in there and constructing the staircase with your own fair hands, you're going to tell, Joe Blogs or Jane Blogs or whatever, you go in and you build this staircase to my advantage because I want this staircase built so I can sell the house. Well, if you're going to get the advantage out of delegating it to an agent, then you better be prepared to take the disadvantages as well, is kind of the thing behind it. So it's really about that aspect of things. It isn't really about the closest thing that we have to atonement, and the closest thing we have to atonement is criminal law. And I took a quote from one of the leading practitioners' textbooks on criminal law, which is Archbold's Criminal Practice and Pleading, where they say, in general, criminal liability only results from personal fault. We do not punish people in the criminal courts for the misdeeds of others. So what they're saying is, in general, you can't punish person A for what person B did wrong. So it's not that criminal.
So was Craig aware of that, or was
I don't know. He didn't. I didn't get the impression he was. I mean, I think it was maybe a bit hard to tell without having read his book. Because to be fair to him, he was just trying to summarise something on a radio show, but it certainly didn't come across. And to me, that's such an important difference between punishing somebody and simply getting that person to make recompense for somebody else's loss in a situation which isn't about criminal wrongdoing. It's only about, something you may have done very little wrong, but you don't look at what the wrong was you did. You look at the consequences for the victim. So it's entirely about what has the victim lost. Whatever the victim's lost, you've got to make up to him. Committing a crime is I'm not going to say that the loss to the victim is irrelevant in crime, but you are looking much more at what's your culpability. How did the outcome of your crime, was it disproportionate to what you actually intended? So there's much more of an element of dealing with crime being about looking at the wrongdoer rather than looking at the results of their wrongdoing. Yeah.
Okay, so that deals with that one. And so, folks, you don't need to go back to listen to episode 5 because I think you've covered it as thoroughly here as you did then.
Oh, okay.
On that one.
Can I get his fee?
Yes. Retreading it all.
And what I'm talking about this, and it took me by surprise because he talked about something I hadn't heard before, and I have to admit I haven't read his book either. And that is something called legal fictions. And he thought that was another great way to understand the atonement. So how does all that work?
Yeah, I again, suppose this is, I would say this, wouldn't I? I did not see the legal fictions as a great answer to anything. There are things there is such a thing as a legal fiction where the law pretends that something is the case in order to be able to do what it needs to do, what is just. But I think when you think about why do we have legal fictions, we have legal fictions because laws are not perfect and you need a workaround. Yeah, okay, I was going to come to that. Yeah. I mean, a good example of a legal fiction is that a company, a corporation, is a person. In law, it's treated as a person. Because if you couldn't treat a company as a person, then companies would be able to get away with all sorts of things because they couldn't be prosecuted or sued, because they would be the results can only happen to people. So you create this legal fiction that a company is a person. Another example of a legal fiction is that adopted children are the biological children of their adoptive parents. It's not literally true, but it's something that the law treats as true so that they can bring in a fairer system to make sure that the law acknowledges the reality of the fact that people are adopted, that they're taken into people's homes, that we want this to happen. We want to support that happening. And so we have to have some way of dealing with it. But in both those examples and in all examples, I mean, the reason you have legal fictions is because life isn't perfect and the rules aren't perfect. But if you're saying that God has a legal fiction, the legal fiction that, to come back to Craig's example of a legal fiction was that Jesus was guilty of the wrongdoing, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. Well, I mean, the first point I would want to make about that is who made that rule? Who made the rule that people had to be punished for wrongdoing? Well, it's supposed to be God's perfect law, and yet it's so unworkable that God has to fall back on creating a legal fiction to find a workaround, just as if he was a human confronted with a fallible human law, and he has to pretend stuff that isn't true so that he can make it all work out according to his purposes. And the other thing that didn't make sense to me about that was, well, even if you leave that objection aside, and even if you say, okay, there is some reason why God has to make use of legal fictions to get around his own rules that he invented or that he embodies and that are supposed to be perfect, even if you do say all that, why that legal fiction? If you're going to have a legal fiction, why not have the legal fiction that humankind is not guilty? Rather than saying Jesus is guilty, humankind is not guilty. And the whole idea was kind of what legal fictions are supposed to achieve was kind of turned on its head, because legal fictions are supposed to bring about justice. They're a workaround to bring about justice.
So you're saying it's a bit like God is almost tied by some kind of something outside himself that says he's got to do something and get out of a tight spot.
Yeah,
and he's the one setting up the whole spot in the first place. Yeah.
That's right. It's like there's a law above God that God can't break.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and he's got his hotshot legal team trying to come up with something clever.
Yeah, what can you do, guys? The council in heavens. Yeah, what can you do? Well, go away. We'll come back with you on that one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I find also, stepping back a bit, the whole idea that a precedent from human law, us fallible lot, can justify the divine, perfect creator of all doing his weird stuff.
Yeah.
It's just trying to find an example, isn't it? It's looking around going, where is there something that's a little bit like this to help us? Here's a law, legal fiction, whatever, somewhere. This will help us. And if there was another problem, they'd look for something else to help us,
Yeah.
So it seems like it's just like, where can we go for an answer? We've got to give an answer, so find something quick. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate that William Lane Craig has done this, actually, because it's felt to me this is weird and silly. And yet no Christian, apart from sort of saying there's a mystery, has sort of come up with we're trying to justify it. They just haven't ever gone there. And William Lane Craig, we know, is a clever guy, and he's done his best. And if that's his best, then we can say, oh, okay, right, there was nothing.
Yes.
I always find that this sort of thing reminds me of O.J. Simpson lawyers, It's just that you just find, you just get the top and the best and the intellectual and say, we've got a problem, please go away and get us an answer. And it seems like it's all over something that doesn't need defending if you say, let's not believe it at all, you know. But anyway, I just feel that it's just hotshot lawyers trying to come up with something. That's the sort of feeling about this. But anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Francis. Okay, we're keen to get into hell, aren't we?
We are. I think the rest of this episode is going to be pure hell for you guys, and we'll move in. Actually, to be honest, I think that we're going to move into a season of hell in terms of having another show on this, because it's a pretty big subject when you get into the whole sort of gamut of hell talk. But we've got to start somewhere, so the rest of this episode certainly will be on this. And so, Ed, do you want to kick it off?
Well, I think I'd like to bounce it back to you because you have a much more personal story on this than the rest of us. So let's get in that way. I
do. So I think before talking about the history of hell, so to speak, which can seem a little bit like, oh, what's the history of hell? Then come on, tell us. You know, I think when you get a personal anecdotal story, it can actually sort of cement it into sort of some kind of, I don't know, there might be people listening out there and go, yeah, you know, I used to think that or thought this. I think that certainly within conservative evangelical Christianity, in which our listeners probably might have come from, or certainly be interested in, there is just no question, and even in the broader culture, there's no question that the concept of Christianity and heaven and hell are just common in your mother's milk language. You inherit it in your church, you inherit it in the culture about hell. But certainly in the conservative evangelical church, the belief in hell is very, very key to sort of the opposite of salvation. And the most common idea that's associated with hell in terms of, say in these evangelical churches, is that there is no question that hell is something that is an experience of conscious pain or torment or suffering throughout all eternity, for as long as God is God. And I can remember as a teenage Christian absolutely sort of taking this on board, being very, very acutely aware of this destiny, and you can see its impact. You know, you firmly believe it. You think salvation is from it, and therefore you feel sorry for humankind, and it makes you want to evangelize in that way. And that was my sort of inner self. But I can also remember in the sort of waking up in the early hours, really finding this concept hard, just to even just get your head around. I mean, I found it hard to think of heaven lasting forever in terms of life of some sort with God. But the idea of people sort of in pain, enduring it for absolutely, and you actually can. It's like thinking if the universe goes on and doesn't end, you just can't get your head around it. And it's like you just can't. You can understand. Okay, if someone said 2 million years, 20 years, anything, you see it as a term, even if it seems like ages. But the idea that you just keep going and that's it. Forever. It actually screwed my mind up quite a lot when I really thought about it. I just could not handle that. And then I was taught that you got the feeling that, certain Protestant evangelicals were the real Christians, and so Catholics weren't really included, or Eastern Orthodox or liberal Christians. And so basically you had this fraction of humanity that were escaping this destiny. So I'd walk out into the streets and I'd say, everybody here doesn't know that they're going over this precipice into this destiny. And it really, really, really affected me in a sort of an emotional sense. But I say, well, no, I believe it is true. It must be true and is true. It's what I'm taught. So you have to have this battle of the minds. Well, I then moved from my church to another church, and I was in a particular church, and this leader of the church was I was in a church called Ichthus in London, and the leader of the church was someone called Roger Forster. And I got a tape passed to me about 1989, and a friend of mine said, "You got to hear this. This is quite radical, And he passed this tape to me, and I listened to this tape, and it was like he was talking about the idea that hell was more like the imagery of what we might think of an incinerator. It's more like we get rid of rubbish by putting it in the fire. If you don't want it, if it's not redeemable, he would talk like that on the tape. And he would go through and say that there's been a misunderstanding, that what God really was saying to us originally, or to the church, or to, the writers of the Bible, was that in fact there is a judgment, there is a calling to account, but hell ends up being sort of maybe a very painful death in God's judgment, in which you suffer, but you also then pass away, and therefore heaven is then left. What remains is all of those living in heaven, or the new earth, or whatever, and then everybody, the universe, devil and his angels, and all the bad people are gone. And I I suddenly thought, oh my God. Well, first of all, I thought this must be wrong and it's heresy, you know. And then I started to think about it and I thought, gosh, there's something very satisfactory about that. I must look into this. There's something in the language of the Bible that sort of even looks like that, you know, destroyed, perished, thrown in a fire, burnt up, you know, the weeds, as Jesus talked about. And I thought, yeah, there's something going on here. And then I found out, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses taught it and some of the cults taught it. I thought, oh, well, it must be wrong, you know, and just by guilt by association, you know. So then I spent many months, and turned out to be years on and off, as just a personal study in without the internet back then. This was like late 80s, whatever. And I suddenly found that this was a big topic in the 19th century, and they were all disagreeing on what the early church said. And I just got more and more like going down rabbit trails. And I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. And really, really came to believe that actually the church went wrong on believing in eternal suffering. So that was really the essence of my personal story. So,
and was it very solo, almost lonely? You were getting books out this evangelical library about that nobody else had taken out for the last 5 years.
Yes, and I was fascinated because what I discovered is that, oh my gosh, you know, I discovered that this isn't some new thing, you know, because people would say, if you just mention something like that, they go, oh, well, that's just liberalism. You're just sort of like, you can't accept the teaching of the Bible, the word of God. You're trying to pander to people's sensitivities today. And I can understand that sentiment, you know, whatever. But I found that all this was rife in the 19th century. And actually, it was more an open talk. It was like people agreed that you could disagree, you know. And then I found that there was actually Christian universalists back then, and they had a view of hell as not being the destruction one or the annihilation one or the eternal torment, but actually that ultimately everyone came out of the fire and was saved. And I was thinking, gosh, these people are talking like it's like, okay, radically different views, but they weren't like saying they weren't real Christians. But suddenly, where I was, when I mentioned it to people, they said, well, you can't be a Christian then, you know. And then the great John Stott came out with it in 1988 with the conditional or annihilationist view. And we'll get into the terms later on what this means. And suddenly it was like almost a new orthodoxy. If John Stott believes this, you go, wow. And I was thrilled, you know, to read that book. And a couple of other heavyweight scholars were mentioning this view that wasn't universalism or the traditional view of hell. And I started to think, gosh, there's some serious stuff going on here. This isn't just some radical notion. This is actually something that I was sort of locked into it because it really changed my whole view of what salvation was about. It was almost like a revolution of my faith to actually discover this, and in a positive way back then.
Yeah, so it kept you going for another decade or two longer. I was listening to, that was great, Andrew, thanks. I was listening to some old Unbelievable shows on hell, and with one of them in particular, I can't remember exactly which, they were really pussyfooting about, not in terms of the ideas, but in how damaging the discussion would be for the listeners. And it finished with that sort of typical, if any of the topics have disturbed you, then here's our helpline to call.
That's interesting.
And you know, they were talking about, you know, child abuse and that kind of thing. So at last I kind of realised just how awful this thing is they're talking about, and that even though it's not something that's terrible in the world, it's something God has decided to do for us.
Yeah, which is why I said at the beginning, this is a very, very, very serious subject, but we often joke about hell because it's almost too unbelievable, ironically, because the show is called Unbelievable. It's too unbelievable to believe that you end up sort of having these, because obviously in the general culture, we talk about hell. It was hell to do this. It was hell going on the train today. You know, we throw out these terms, but in theology, it has very clear, distinct meanings, even though there's division. But it's actually, I think it's a trauma, particularly to children, to be told this. I mean, I was told this when I was, 11 and 12, that the destiny of people who don't believe is this destiny. And the kid is left to sort of think about, oh my gosh. And you just sort of think, well, God is like that. It's what God does to people who don't believe in Jesus. And you think, you just sort of almost accept it. And then you just have to try for your brain to cope with it. Francis, what was your sort of growing up understanding about hell?
Well, my mother quite shocked me when I was a child by telling me she didn't believe in hell. It was for that reason. She was brought up as a Catholic, but she said, I don't believe that a loving God would send people to suffer for eternity. And I thought, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, I don't believe in hell now either.
If only it was that simple for me. Yeah, at the time. What about you then, Ed? Because you probably seem to have more of a lovey-dovey church. And what was going on there?
I didn't join my lovey-dovey church till I was 16.
Oh.
And yeah, it was nice, Anglican-y niceness. But they were the kind of charismatic Anglicans, but it just wasn't, you didn't go there really. And my upbringing was thoroughly atheist, so I had no background trauma. Yeah, for me...
Did it bother you, though, Ed, when you became a Christian at 16? Did the concept of hell, did it play a big part, or did you not worry about it?
What really... Its biggest impact was it made a massive barrier between me and non-Christians.
Right.
So here I was going to kind of eternal bliss, and they're having this absolutely dreadful future for them. You just can't treat them as a fellow human being. They are so different that it just generates this psychological barrier. So it really added to the them and us, in and out, we're in the tribe, you're not in a way that was unloving at all, but it was just horrible. Another thing that was going on was an enormous amount of anxiety around parenthood, because you knew that there was every chance that your dear children were going to reject the faith come time.
Oh.
And so you were bringing this child into the world with its destiny likely to be eternal hell.
I am absolutely glad you said that, because it's another thing that bothered me when I had my own children, because at the time, and we're going to go into this in the technical aspects of all of this sort of hell, but the idea, generally speaking, is that people, it's been popularly taught over centuries and centuries that humans have an immortal soul. That's the language. It's a soul that's something like eternal, And I used to think, oh no, if I have kids, and I was an Arminian, so you weren't like a Calvinist that says you're predestined to be saved, and why would your own kids suddenly be luckily predestined to be saved? It's a weird one, that, even for Calvinists. Well, I'm lucky. I've been predestined, so have my children. But either way, if I'm bringing I used to think this. I'm bringing eternal souls into the universe. I think it'd be better for me not to have kids, just in case that eternal soul ends in an eternal flame. And so I honestly thought like that. So my whole anxiety about life I had on top of me, when somebody in a secular world who knows nothing about this can just have an enjoyable life about having kids, It's hard enough coming into a global warming kind of problem on the planet with kids, what they're going to go, let alone, that's nothing. As soon as they die, they could be going into the flames.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I can't imagine it. I mean, there are enough anxieties about having a child, and supposing your child has problems that you can't cope with, and just ordinary physical problems. But if on top of that you have to worry about their spiritual problems, which may mean you sort of wave goodbye to them on Judgment Day, and enjoy your eternity of suffering, won't you?
Yeah, exactly. And then things like the Holocaust, which was awful to be put through. This will come up later when we talk about the different views of hell, but to be put through what Jewish people and others were put through in the Holocaust in being gassed. Absolutely horrific. I used to think, somebody said that Anne Frank would have gone to hell, Jewish person, didn't receive Jesus Christ, Now I know that a lot of people disagree in that, and really, but it comes against your Christian character. I know that couldn't be true, but basically, theologically, someone like Anne Frank, or her relatives, say, for example, were thrown into the gas ovens or something like that in Auschwitz. And then boom, they wake up on the wrong side of salvation.
I know.
And then they go to hell in this traditional sense. I just think the universe is a madhouse in Christianity. That's what I felt.
I always feel that it's so ironic that Christians, when they're advancing the moral argument, will so frequently say, well, what about Hitler then? What about all those Jews he murdered? If you don't believe in actually, I do believe in objective morality, but a lot of atheists don't. So they'll say, well, if you don't have God, then you don't have objective morality, and if you don't have objective morality, then there was nothing wrong with what Hitler did, and clearly it was a terrible thing that he did. And I sort of think, yeah, but what he did was not as bad as what you're going to say that God's going to do to them after Hitler's finished with them. What God's going to do is even worse.
Yeah. Well, also, if one of the prison guards later becomes a Christian, there's rejoicing in heaven at the lost son who's come back, and
Yeah,
this
that's
is all
right.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
And he sits in heaven.
Yeah, or Hitler suddenly in the death bunker, just before it happens, or whatever the story was, he goes, "Oh, I've had a vision of Christ. Oh, I repent." Yeah, in heaven.
That's
And
right.
then Mother
He goes to heaven.
Teresa at the end goes, "Oh, I don't believe this God stuff anymore." Goes to hell.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, people have all kinds of theologies to say, "Hey, come on, you're overkilling all the arguments and stuff." I'm just saying these are the thoughts as somebody experiences life in humanity.
It was wonderful. Your we'll give it a plug. Your Christian diversity that you do. It's about 7 minutes or something on just different clips of people talking confidently from the pulpit from completely different viewpoints.
I've done that like on 14 different subjects. It's called Christian Diversity on YouTube. It come up, and I'm there. One on hell is about 7 minutes, and I've got things like somebody like John Piper, Chris Date is in there, some evangelical universalists are there, and I basically got them sort of not talking to each other, but just saying elements of their view, and they're just absolutely opposed. And I thought any secular person or other Christian is going to go, oh, what do I believe now? What do I believe? What should I believe? But I think our humanity cries out that something is wrong somewhere.
Okay. Well, your brain's full of this, but you can actually put it into a chronological sequence, I guess.
Yes, I think so, and I think the chronological sequence to start from is where do the concepts of hell come from that ended up where we are and why we were ending up with views like this within Christianity, so that when you become a Christian, say in the 21st century, whatever church you're in, you pick up something about hell and judgment. Where did this all start? Why is it there? So really, it's best to go right the way back to at the beginning. So it's funny that whatever that is, where do you start that? But basically, I suppose what I definitely found is that in research, and I think that you look at scholarly material, everything I'm going to say today is nothing novel, nothing new, and it's all out there in the literature of scholarly sort of research and study into this area. And so all I am is sort of my own research came up with stuff, but it just discovered what's there. Now, when you look at the Old Testament as a whole, it really says, well, to put it bluntly, absolutely nothing about endless suffering in a hell as some kind of punishment for not belief in Yahweh. That might be a shock to some people to go, wow, they may think of this odd verse in, say, Isaiah or some other strange verse somewhere and go, what about this? What about this? But we'll get onto that in probably the next podcast, that sort of thing. But essentially, throughout the broad picture of the Old Testament, it's even seriously debated among the best scholars that nobody really quite knows what even happens when you die, let alone any kind of later judgment. It seems that for the best part of the Old Testament, you've got an idea of the immediate afterlife, might be something to do with a term called Sheol, which you've heard of, Ed and Francis, Sheol?
Mm-hmm, I've heard of it.
I've heard of it, and the corresponding New Testament sort of language that might be translated like that is Hades. But the problem is with that is these terms have an evolutionary aspect to it, and also they're severely debated. So you will get a lot of scholars that say Sheol in the Old Testament is basically a metaphor for no afterlife. It's just simply talking about in a very sort of interesting way about the fact that God created man out of the earth and he breathed into him the breath of life. So he wasn't in existence before. And then when the breath of life goes, he returns to the dust, and that's it. But it's used in the language of Sheol, like a sort of, a metaphor for the grave and death. That is a very serious scholarly view. Bart Ehrman takes that view pretty well consistently all the way through.
Yeah.
There's an alternative.
Even NIV notes have it.
Yeah, that's right. There's an
alternative.
alternative.
In the Old Testament NIV, it says Sheol, and it says in the footnotes, could easily mean grave.
Could easily mean grave. Now, some people, the other scholarly view is a sort of either a mixed view, or they say it's actually not a metaphor for just not being non-existent again, like that, the opposite of creation. But they argue that in fact it's a sort of a shadowy version of yourself that sort of exists in a very sort of, I don't know, you can hardly move, you're sort of lethargic, you're sort of existing, but there's no life as we know it on earth, and it's bodiless. And some people take that view about Sheol. I tend to think myself, and in a lot of research about that, is I tend to think the best answer is that we might have an evolutionary concept going on, that at first it seems to be the grave, and it's sort of really just a metaphorical, because it talks about people dying and they lay their swords down with them in some passages, and there's a sort of you could just say, well, it can't all be literal, so it must be just a metaphor for the grave. Others would say, no, you've got this sort of shades, like Samuel comes up and they raise him up from the dead, and he said, why did you disquiet me, and say he's coming up from Sheol, and he was like maybe unconscious, asleep, dreamy, and he's sort of brought up, and he doesn't like being disturbed. So there's sort of tension in the Old Testament a little bit.
That could have just been a metaphorical, visiony thing.
Yeah, that's right. So it's very difficult to hang anything on this. Sorry,
if a witch is doing all this, then you could just say the whole thing was a deception.
Yeah, and that's why you say you can't hang anything. Bart Ehrman talks about that, and he says that it could mean this, it could mean that. And this is the problem with all kinds of verses, if you just hang something on one passage. But the concept's still around, you see, because there was the surrounding nations that did seem to think there was an after thing going on. And therefore, if the Jews were slowly getting imbibed with that, they'd probably go from some sort of extinction to sort of a sleepy, shallowy thing, which you could be, you're not really, maybe you're not even conscious, you're just sort of, but you could be awoken up, and there's something there. Other people argue that that's key, because when the resurrection started to evolve and come out, that you'd say what happens is that you bring the people out of Sheol and reclothe them with some kind of body, and you've got your resurrection from death and Hades. I tend to think there's an evolution, so I tend to think you can't just say it's totally a metaphor for the grave, but there's a very good case that many of the verses just mean that. So and this is to talk about when you die. This is absolutely nothing to do with whether there's a future judgment or not. So in a lot of these passages, basically the Old Testament doesn't really think about a future resurrection. It's just not there. So the punishment and judgment in the Old Testament by far, by percentage, probably 95%, 96, 7, 8%, is that the punishment is this life punishment, that you're brought to an early death. You're brought to Sheol or death or Hades early, i.e. you're destroyed, you die. And that the blessings of the communities are to do with that you continue and you survive and you prosper and you have kids and you are not in battle, you're not in war. That's the blessing. The curse is that God will come with sort of diseases and all kinds of judgments, and then you will be destroyed from the land, which means they sort of perish in so not very nice circumstances, but they're removed, and the righteous are the ones that remain. That is a very strong theme through the Psalms and through most of the Old Testament. So it's really this earthly. Judgment is something that removes you in the middle of a prime life, whereas blessing is that you can continue. And so I believe that's the seeds of ultimately what's evolved into hell. It really comes from that principle, because the afterlife it was going to Sheol early was bad. Having a long life and then going to Sheol, whatever that means, grave or some kind of floaty thing, is actually good. It's how long can you last?
I remember that in Genesis.
Yeah.
Where they have these lovely old patriarchs. Yeah. Well, maybe they're not lovely, but they have these patriarchs and they live lovely long lives. And at the end of their lives, sounds really lovely, but they're just gathered to their ancestors.
So their fathers. And that could be seen as literally because of the grave, physically, you're just gathered and buried where your fathers are, or there's something going on. Yeah. So I came out very ambivalent to exactly what Sheol was. But that you do, and this is the problem, when you do serious scholarship, you have to sort of balance out what serious scholarship comes to, and even they're split. So that sort of solves that. Now, isn't that enough?
Can I throw something in the works, Ed? And you can cut this bit out if you want. So nowadays, people talk about your body, your soul, and your spirit. That's centuries, millennia later, that's what we've got to. And we know for sure that soul is just not a thing in the body of the Old Testament. But you talked about breath, and now breath and spirit is the same word, really.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So, could it be that they have two? They have body and spirit, and somehow the spirit could be something that survives.
This is very, 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 very difficult again, and this is why you get different views in theology, because people take a certain set of texts and run with it. That's your grid, and then everything else is interpreted in that. Someone takes another set of texts and reinterpret the others. This goes on all the time in theology. And so, we don't even know really, kind of, it's so difficult to know about how the human being is believed to be in Hebrew thought. There are some basic themes that a lot of people have consensus on, but we basically think humans have got a lot of problems in working out exactly what we are according to biblical thought, because there's also an evolution, I believe. But yes, the soul, the spirit, the breath of life in Genesis is breathed in, and he becomes a living soul, no different than the animals. They become living souls. It's a living being, really, living creature. So soul in the early parts of the Bible has got nothing to do with some Greek idea of something eternal.
So if we've got spirits, then our cat's got a spirit as well.
Exactly, because there's passages in Psalms that talk about fish, and this, the spirit is taken away and they die, and you think, well, you don't think, we tend to think in a modern Greek sense of, the spirit is like the conscious being and it's eternal and goes up to heaven, and the body dies. That's a later sort of misunderstanding of what they were trying to communicate. In Revelation it talks about the sea creatures dying and the breath of life, the spirit was taken away, something like that. But it seems to me that sometimes soul and spirit is interchangeable, and sometimes is distinct, because the man became a living soul, and then the breath of life was breathed into him to become that. And when the breath of life goes, there is no soul, so it's just a body in the thing, and the spirit has returned. But that's not a personality, that's an animating principle. Bar Ehrman argues this very strongly for the Hebrew thought. So anyway, Francis, you got any comments on that? Or
I don't think I've got anything much to add at the moment. I think you both covered it fairly fully. Yeah, I mean, I my understanding of the early Old Testament was that they had no concept of an afterlife. It was this life. It was this life you had to try and make good for yourselves.
Yes, and that's very, very key. That a lot of this is not about. So whatever the Sheol thing is, it's not to do with what happens in Sheol is a key thing. It's to do with dying in a destruction soon and early and under God's judgment is one thing, and living a long old life without war is another. Now, isn't it surprising that if this eternity of hell is actually true, you would have thought from page one, I'm creating Adam, he's an eternal being inside, and if you sin, you will go to this eternal destiny. There is nothing like that in the entire Old Testament. Isn't that strange? If it was, I used to think this, isn't that strange?
Yeah.
That you haven't got the pages of the Bible pouring out about this destiny everywhere you look, if that was the truth that say God was trying to communicate. It's not like that. It's all this life, as you're saying, Francis. It's all about Israel being protected and the generations going on forever and not dying early under judgment, And you think, gosh, what happened then? And that leads us to the next stage. Ed?
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm going to set you up with it. By the time Jesus rolls around, the resurrection is a thing, and they kind of swim in the idea of resurrection, and most people believe in it, except for the Sadducees, famously. And all three versions of hell that we later come on to require a resurrection of everybody to make them work. Because you are resurrected then to be thrown into the fire, either to be destroyed or to be refined and come good, or to be tormented forever. So resurrection actually is key in our next step. So where does that come from?
Well, some people argue that there's a couple of hints elsewhere, but basically at the end of the day, when it boils down to it, it really boils down to Daniel. Now, you see, this is where we start to have some interesting problems. Conservatives and fundamentalists all believe Daniel was written in the 6th century by a person called Daniel, and it was like prophesying stuff 400 years before its time. But most critical scholars by a long shot believe that it's a 2nd century document, very late. And oddly enough, and ironically enough, one of the reasons is that actually talk of the resurrection around Jewish culture at that time was in the 2nd century, not in the 6th. And so lo and behold, it's in Daniel. And there's this one particular verse at the end that talks about this great judgment coming and everything else. And it says, some shall be raised to everlasting life or eternal life, and some shall be raised. Very interesting phrase. So this is where some people say, aha, you see, here's your eternal torment. It actually says some will be raised to some will be raised to eternal life, and some to eternal contempt. And so very interesting. So that's the first thing we get, probably from a 2nd century document that looks like something after Sheol, whatever that is. Daniel is very relevant because this is the first hint of definite post-death situation going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you're talking about the eternal contempt thing, then you have to read in that to mean eternal conscious torment, which is
you do.
Contempt and conscious torment are completely
different things, and it's even different than that because well, first of all, there is a possibility that some shall be raised to eternal life. There is a sort of a possible, it's not very commonly accepted, but there is a possibility that it means the rest remain in death, so they've been destroyed under the God already. And that's when if you link it with Isaiah and you see similar patterns, that's where you get that idea from. But if you did say that, okay, these somehow the non-believers or the bad people are raised, eternal contempt doesn't really work, as you said. Some people just read straight into it the tradition of eternal torment, when actually there's other passages in the Bible, particularly Jeremiah, that talks about a city being destroyed and an everlasting hissing will be upon them and their memory shall never be forgotten. And this was about a city that's presumably destroyed in the real world in sort of Jeremiah's talk. And that language about everlasting contempt or everlasting hissing, I think it's in that, is a very common Jewish theme where you despised the bad when they died and you had their memories. A bit like today, you know, people have a hissing memory and they'd spit on Hitler. You know, he's died a long time ago, but his memory, there's a contempt for Hitler today and he doesn't even exist, presumably, in some people's minds. So the idea of eternal contempt comes much more fits with the Jewish idea that there's a contempt from people towards those that have been destroyed, not an endless suffering of personal eternal beings going on there. So that's really, you know, so once we talk about that verse like that, there is nothing about endless suffering in the Old Testament whatsoever. You know,
I'm struggling to find it. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked continue to be wicked. Is that the verse?
No. That's another verse. That sounds very similar to the end of Revelation, actually. I'm not sure what verse you're referring to.
Daniel 12:10.
Continue to be wicked. Yeah. I mean, again, that doesn't, I mean, this is the thing. When it comes to the traditional view of eternal torment, every passage that's actually looked at, it doesn't nearly anyway, it doesn't actually say it. It says something actually different, and it's always a reading into it with an assumption somewhere. And so, funny enough, that, you know, the word contempt is the same word in Isaiah. At the end of Isaiah, it talks about God has come to judge, and he's killed all these people in judgment, and their bodies are laying out. And he says that they will be an abhorrence to all that will look upon them. Now, that's interesting because that word abhorrence is the same word for contempt. So what you can see here is that people can have contempt for destroyed dead people. It doesn't mean the dead people are suffering. So really, I think it's a pretty clear case that that's what's going on with the word eternal contempt. It's an abhorrence towards the people that have been the wicked ones, you know, by the good ones still alive. So that would be my take on that. So yeah, any comments, both of you?
Well, this
or
is coming. This is resurrection as well now.
Yes. So if they are raised to life at that point, then you would imagine that the resurrection of those that aren't good can be destroyed again, so they can die under God's judgment. And so this is where the first idea of being raised to judgment comes. So this idea of, you know, God is the judge of all, and you will face God one day. You know, you hear this language, isn't it? You will face your maker. This is the first thing about facing your maker, I believe, that's in the Bible. And it's Daniel, it's the end of Daniel, which is a very late book in my view, 2nd century, about 164 it was written. Yep. So we're 2 centuries less, or a bit less towards, about 2 centuries before Jesus here with this statement. And then we move on.
Yeah. And the whole thing is about waking up, I notice. It's
yes.
not resurrection.
Well, yes, I suppose you could say that's right. So somebody could say, well, okay, what does waking up mean? As opposed to, sleeping in the dust of the earth, though, and then you wake up. It's like, the imagery is generally be seen to be some sort of early stage of resurrection. And you've got to bear in mind that back in the 2nd century, outside of the Bible, there's all sorts of talk going on. And this is where it gets really complex, because this is where the terms... this is where people back then were even starting to were talking about the afterlife in terms of Gehenna and Sheol, and the evolving of these terms were starting to have a mix and change, and it's probably blending with pagan views of the soul and Zoroastrianism, and suddenly behind the scenes here we're having a very different mix of resurrection plus soul survival now. So now you actually, at this time of Daniel, you actually get books that talk about the soul surviving as opposed to the body, and you also get talk of a resurrection. And so this is where we get this tension today. Do you die and go to heaven, or do you wait for the resurrection to go to heaven? And even in the church, Christians don't know what the heck they believe, because there's both views there in the church. Did you think when you died that you'd go to heaven, Ed, years ago?
Yeah.
You didn't think that I didn't think you would sleep or go to Hades or be somewhere else and then be raised at the end of the age and then go to heaven or a new earth.
That's right. It was all completely simple and wrong.
Right, yes. Whereas I believed I would go consciously to somewhere called Hades, like a good part of it. And I believed that at the end of the age, I would be raised bodily and I would live on a new earth, like a revamped earth. Very much like
really?
This one. Yes.
So
yes.
What was going to happen to you in Hades? What was Hades?
Oh, well, this is why there's different views. A lot of people think, I think as we go through the New Testament, we'll talk about Hades.
Okay.
This is where we mix into the intermediate state. But basically, the stereotype in the church and even outside of the church is that if you died tonight, will you go to heven or hell? It's actually so foreign to the Bible, even in the New Testament. It is so foreign. So a lot of listeners that are listening to this will go, what? But I thought when I died, I went to hell. I mean, heaven, sorry, if you're a Christian. But no, it's not as simple as that. And it's neither the language either of the Bible. Yeah.
Now, we've got these people who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were sort of quite hard on religious nutcase types from our modern viewpoint. But they were Jews thoroughly. And they were probably a sect of Judaism or something.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing is, like everything else, there's always debates about exactly who they were.
Yeah. Anyway,
that's not a subject. Yeah.
Do we know what they thought?
Certainly the groups like that thought of this ties back into the other podcast we've done where we talked about preterism and the imminent end, and it was soon, and it was in their generation. Oddly enough, these sects also thought that the teacher of righteousness was teaching that God's judgment would come soon in their generation to judge the world. And this is where I go back to God's judgment comes to those that are living. It's not necessarily to do with a resurrection. And they believed that something would happen soon in their generation, and that's what they were applying some of the Old Testament texts to. I don't know in detail, but I think some of these people might have believed that the soul or something about you survived without the body. Others believed in a resurrection. And I think there was probably a mix of views going on with these people, but they seem to think that God's action was decisive. And I really don't think from their teachings you can get anything like the traditional view of endless torment, and possibly not. Maybe you might get some early universalistic texts. And later, I think in the next podcast, we'll probably go into what these views are, because we've been throwing out terms like universalism, annihilationism, and eternal torment. And I think there's needs a lot more clarification to where these terms came from and why they're used. But yeah, so I would say that we can glean some stuff from this, but you're still kind of far from the traditional views of hell in their writings by a long shot.
Okay, so we got to Jesus.
Yes, that's right. So suddenly we now set the scene for Jesus. So I think what we'll do for the rest of this podcast is just sort of refer to perhaps what Jesus may have thought and the gospel writers may have thought. And then perhaps for the next podcast, we'll move into the sort of the epistles, Revelation, and then a bit of church history on this. What do you think about that approach?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm good with that.
There's probably a few questions here to do with Jesus and everything else. So yeah. So when Jesus comes on the scene, if we're going to sort of assume, like we would hear probably in this podcast, that he was an apocalyptic prophet, he would have come on the scene much like John the Baptist. You know, God's judgment is coming soon. It's coming in this generation. It's coming, before some of you here die. That judgment in a Jewish thought, I think Jesus would have thought that God somehow is going to supernaturally come and destroy, I would say, the Romans, and people on earth would be judged. And that's why I keep mentioning those that were alive on the earth. I think that Jesus would have thought it would happen very soon, and he's warning them to sort of repent now. He's not like the typical evangelical in that sense. It's a repenting. He's like a renewal of a Jewish movement. I think at that point. So I think that he talks about this. So when you come to the Gospels, can any of you suddenly think of certain passages in the Gospels about hell? What comes to your mind?
There's that one that I've read where I think it's used by people who support eternal conscious torment, where he says, "The blessed shall go with me to eternal." I mean, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. "The blessed go with me to eternal life and bliss,
yep,
and the rest go to eternal torment." And what they say is, well, the two terms are exactly the same. When he says he doesn't distinguish between one sort of eternal thing and the other sort of eternal thing. So Jesus is indicating that the torment is eternal.
Yeah,
what is torment?
Yeah, again, that's another thing. Like Ed, you pointed out before with the contempt. It actually says eternal punishment, not torment, for starters.
Okay.
Okay, and then you have to say, well, what is the punishment? And that begs the question. So again, you're reading it into you. It could be argued anyway. Obviously, the traditional view says that this is the linchpin, this is the foundation, this is the concrete that sets the edifice. Is this verse? But it's strange enough. Sorry, Ed, you might want to comment on this as well. Yeah,
I think if you just take a broad brush of the teaching of Jesus, it's all about destruction. All the parables that mention this talk about destruction. So you've got the good plants or the good crop, and then the weeds are gathered up and burnt in the fire. And the word destruction is used quite a lot. Is it the path to life and the path to destruction?
And so basically, yes, this is the tenor of not only like in the Old Testament, all the judgment languages, all involving, it could involve pain, it could involve sorrow and torment and stuff, but basically you were destroyed from the land through disease and all kinds of things in a horrible way, but you were removed basically in dying somehow in a very bad way. Jesus doesn't seem to talk any different. En masse, he talks about destruction. Now, it's interesting that the book of Matthew, I always found this when I was doing the research, was that the same writer, because you could go to other passages and books and say, you do be like an evangelical and say, well, this verse says this. If you just look at Matthew, the same writer says in Matthew 10:28, don't fear those who can kill the body, but do fear him who can destroy body and soul in Gehenna. We'll come a bit later, I think, to actually now might be the time to talk about Gehenna in those terms. But basically, the writer of Matthew thought that Gehenna, the fearful thing was that you would have your body and soul destroyed in Gehenna. So you have to balance that with what he said about going into eternal punishment. You say, well, how do you go into eternal punishment and have your body and soul destroyed? How do you equate the two? Well, the simple answer would be that there's no comeback. Now we might die and be raised for the judgment, but when you are destroyed in Gehenna, all of you is gone, including the soul or whatever that is, animating principle, whatever you might think it is. You can never come back. You can never be overturned. So you have suffered an eternal punishment. Now, Francis, what would you think about that if I put it like that to you?
That seems a good, strong argument. Perhaps I can come back you with another story
yes,
that
certainly
springs to mind, which is Dives and Lazarus.
Yes.
Well,
Ed, you might have something to say on this. It's a fascinating story. Yeah,
I have the feeling that you're all set up, ready to go, tearing this one apart.
Set up? Yeah. I've already gone. That's why. Yeah. Ed, what do you want to start saying on this?
Okay, yeah. I heard Bart Ehrman talking about this.
Yes.
And he said, for a start, Bible scholars do doubt that actually was something from Jesus. Obviously, there's loads in the New Testament, in the Gospels rather, they debate whether that could be Jesus or not. And this is quite low down the list of things that critical scholars consider to be likely to be said by Jesus. But really, I think that it's not very helpful to mention that, because of these are debates between Christians who believe that Jesus did speak. Yeah. So The next thing is people say is that it's a parable, and that is disputed, of course. It does have parable feel to it, like there was a man is a sort of the way that Jesus starts parable. Yeah. But there are aspects of it that aren't like other parables. Um, Often parables start, and it was like, or the kingdom of God will be like. And so we don't have to say it's a parable, but to me, the big thing is all versions of hell have people suffering in a fire. And this is a scene of someone suffering in a fire. It doesn't say one way or the other whether this fire is torment forever, is a purification that's really unpleasant, and you end up through the other side and reconciled with God, or if you're on the way out of destruction during this fire. So it really doesn't give guidance between those three options that believing Christians go with.
Yeah, I would come in. I would actually. That's a very good point that you can make there, Ed. But I would come in at a very different angle than that. I would say that the one thing that you're doing there is assuming that it's a final state. This death, by the way, they have just died. They haven't been resurrected. This might be a different view of Luke to what even Jesus thought, because it seems like the rich man died and was carried away to Hades. Oddly, the word is Hades as opposed to Gehenna. These are two different words in the New Testament, and they do seem to refer to different things. It's certainly in the New Testament, it referred to different things. And so Gehenna would be sort of this final judgment, which might include resurrected people going into Gehenna and then being destroyed. Whereas this one is being carried away when you die. Within the context, first of all, it's Hades, something that is later to be destroyed in the New Testament down the line. So that's interesting. So you need to unpack what Hades might be. But secondly, even within the parable, even if it's not a parable and it's trying to refer to the afterlife, it's something that seems to be in a strange way bodiless, but not bodiless. It's really, really weird. And he says, can you send people back and tell them about this? So this seems to be, if it was literalized, a concurrent thing that's going on with humanity as it's going on, because he says, tell my brothers. Yeah. If this was post-resurrection and the great white throne judgment, as they say, this is not a valid point to make. You would say, it's too late for everyone now. We're at the judgment. But this is actually, it's like it's happening and they're looking down and saying, quick, tell my brothers I don't want to come to this place. That's if it's literalized. Christians are split to whether actually the whole thing, Jesus is actually talking about money and wealth, and he's just making a point. And so people argue that there was a popular Jewish tale at the time that sounds very similar to this. And there was, I remember researching this, that some Jews at the time did believe that when you died, you went to Hades and it wasn't nice, and you waited until the judgment. And so even if that was a reality, Jesus isn't trying to say necessarily that he believes it. He's using this story as a point to talk about money and wealth. And a bit like we might use something from Harry Potter, and say, as Harry said to Hermione this, and you go, oh, so that means Harry's real. So I would probably take that tack to say that it isn't really talking about the Great White Throne judgment, and neither is it historically, literally, what necessarily the writer believed is real anyway. It's a story that he was using to make another point. So that's a very different way of coming to another conclusion about it.
Here we go. Francis gave the name of the rich man, which isn't given by Luke. So how does Francis know his name?
Yeah, how did you get that, Francis?
Oh, folk memory. Obviously it was...
So is that in the story that Luke or Jesus is riffing off?
The story that Jesus could be alluding to is another story that actually, when you read it, is quite similar. And it's also got some significant differences, but it's not, I don't think it's Dives. I just think tradition sort of gave him a name. Okay. And so it's Dives. But yes, it's one of those things that is, like you said, Francis, you've picked it up in the stories as it's circulated. And it is something that people say. It's Lazarus and Dives.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. And but it's not actually technically, it's evolved from that.
I was going to ask you, is there a kind of typical Gehenna verse that we could
Yeah, you see, I just need to go to these verses that unfortunately, in translations in the Bible, Hades here has been translated hell, and of course Gehenna has been translated hell. So when people read, "Oh, well, you go to hell when you die," I think the idea traditionally that you go to hell when you die comes from exactly this verse, and it really is like the only one in the Bible. And if you see it as hell, but actually it's Hades, and Hades maybe is a different concept, I think, from Gehenna. Although some Jews did mix the terms, and this is the problem. When you get this extra Jewish literature, but later in Rabbinic Judaism, they actually used Hades and Gehenna interchangeably. So it really does confuse the issue, and it really makes it complex. But if you're sticking to the Bible, Hades seems to be something that happens to you. You die, and you're in a death Hades state, whatever that is. You're resurrected, you're out of a death Hades state. Okay, and that's the distinction. Gehenna, Matthew 10:28, fear him who can destroy body and soul in Gehenna. That's one Gehenna verse.
Right.
Jesus does another famous one where he says, if you say fool, you might be liable to Gehenna. Yeah. So that means like, God, that's if Gehenna was endless torment, it's quite something to say, you fool. Endless torment was Jesus's view of the punishment. I really find that difficult to believe. It's more like a heavy punishment, or perhaps you're killed and your body's left for the birds to eat or something, and that's your punishment. But the idea of endless torment in that context just seems wildly un-Jewish and just not right,
And what about if your hand causes you to sin?
Yeah.
What, is that a Gehenna one?
That's if your hand causes you to sin, I'm swiping my memory now, and it's thrown into the. No, I think that is that's thrown into a place where the fire is not quenched. By the way, the fire is not quenched is actually a later evolved term in the New Testament. There's some funny business going on. The original sort of wording is actually the unquenchable fire. You might say, what's the difference? But one sounds a little bit more punchy than the other, If you're thrown into unquenchable fire, you might have a different idea of a fire that's never quenched. It actually doesn't, it could be the same thing. But yes, that's better to go into Gehenna. But sorry, better to go into the kingdom of God, I think, and have your hand chopped off, then go into the fire or the unquenchable fire. Yeah.
I love that one because it always made me think of if your penis causes you to sin.
Just chop it off.
That's the one part of the body that actually causes you to sin.
I think even the destructionist view can come in handy here, because it's saying, look, it's better to go into the kingdom of God missing your hand than actually have your whole body lost and destroyed in Gehenna. You see, that would sort of fit as well, rather than better to lose your hand physically, but your whole body and soul be tormented forever. It doesn't quite fit, Yeah. Mark 9. That's right.
Let's have a look. Okay. So, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than to go with two hands to go into hell, where the fires never go out.
Yes, that's right. Let me mention about the fires never go out, by the way, because some people say, isn't that plain? If you're thrown into an unquenchable fire, it must mean, because the fire is not quenched, you will last forever in it, like co-eternal, unquenchable fire, unquenchable person. That's actually not the Hebrew way. If you can go all over the Old Testament and find loads of passages where God creates an unquenchable fire and it burns up and consumes everything viciously in its path. It's precisely because it's unquenchable that nothing can survive. A quenchable fire, you might survive it. Okay, so the destructionist argument about hell is that actually unquenchable fire means that you will not survive this. You eventually be destroyed and there's nothing left, rather than it means a symbol of endless ongoing pain. Do you see the point there, Francis Ed? You can get some points there, yeah? I couldn't put that fire out. The house, my house burnt down because the fire brigade couldn't put it out. Not that the house is always going to be there because you can't put it out. Okay, big difference. And the Jewish use of the Old Testament of unquenchable fire means it really does mean, when you read the passages, it means the forest was consumed because the fire was unquenchable. It really is simple as that.
And that is a reference to Isaiah 66:24.
Yeah, which oddly enough, when Jesus says, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, and people say, isn't that plain? if you go into a place where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched, well, first of all, are you thinking literal worms that are immortal? I mean, what's going on here? And, but actually Jesus seems to be echoing Isaiah when everybody has been plainly killed, because it talks about the dead bodies that are left after God's judgment are left open for worms and the burning fires to burn the corpses. People look on it in abhorrence. And this is in the Old Testament, and it says, where their worm dies not and their fire is not quenched. It isn't in Isaiah got anything to do with agony going on. It's to do with the abhorrence and having been destroyed and died in fire. And then these are the remains, okay? Jesus seems to be picking up that and saying, God's judgment, I'm picking up Isaiah basically and saying, this is what's coming in this generation to you lot if you don't repent. Yeah. So there we go again. So if we keep this theme going, we're pretty consistent so far, yeah? Yeah.
And there's some pretty impressive worms that don't mind fire.
Yeah, impressive worms that are immortal as well. The worms do not die. And of course, humans are thought not to die as well,
Titanium worms or something.
Yes, there's amazing worms, yeah. And so it's really a metaphor. It's just, you can see it's a metaphor in Isaiah. You can see that it's to do with the finality of destruction.
Yes.
You can see that there's an abhorrence towards the people that have been destroyed. And then suddenly it's like, here we are, eternal torment. Yeah.
The Isaiah passage is poetry.
Exactly. And then Jesus is,
poetry. Prophetic poetry.
Yeah, he's talking about judgment. And another thing, by the way, I think Bartoma mentions this, is that a horrific thing to Jews is that if you died and you weren't buried and you were left for the scavengers and your body rots, that is a humiliation beyond belief in a Jewish culture. So there's something powerful that we in the modern culture have missed here. It's like, so if you threaten somebody and say, we're going to kill you and your body's going to be left in the street for the scavengers, that would be so horrific to a Jewish mind. They would say, please, I don't want that fate. And because you don't want the memory, you don't want to know before you die that the memory of you will always be abhorrent. Yeah. And so that's a very key thing that's completely missed in hell talk in the church. And so if you start to get back to the culture surrounding nations, surrounding language, you start to get a different feel for all the language that's been used for endless torment. And you start to then have a different view. I sound like some sort of evangelical Christian here, don't I? But anyway, I'm just going through what I thought ultimately the Bible seemed to be talking about.
Okay, you said you're going to do Jesus. We haven't mentioned the Gospel of John, which really doesn't talk about hell at all. But it does actually agree with this idea where it talks about, the famous verse is a great one to start. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So the alternative to joining the tribe and having your everlasting life is perishing.
That's right.
Even if there's no fire or destruction or worms, it's still perishing.
It's still perishing. But here's the twist, you see. Here's the twist where the tradition went. We got ourselves into a sort of what's called like a bastard offspring of language here, because I think we'll probably go more of this into the next podcast when we get into more technical terms. But basically, the idea of eternal conscious torment has been backed up by the idea of what's called the immortality of the soul. And that basically is just like the Greeks. They thought souls were eternal because they were immortal. They did not die. They thought they were eternal and couldn't pass away because they did not perish. This was the language that Plato used in the same Greek language as the New Testament, Koine Greek. And so what's really interesting is that the Bible, the New Testament, uses the language of extinction of being that Plato used for the same meaning. He thought souls would cease to exist if they perished. Isn't it strange that you've got the most famous verse in the Bible that says, he that, can you quote it again, Ed?
Yeah, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever should believe on him should not perish, but have everlasting life.
That's right. And that word perish, by the way, is the same word that Jesus said, fear him who can destroy, perish, just different ways of saying the same thing, the body and soul in Gehenna. So to perish in Greek thought, and I believe it's consistent with the New Testament as well, that perish is always linked to dying, passing away, becoming no more, end of your life. But the tradition has twisted it, and they said that actually the soul is imperishable. So perish means to be absent from God, separated from God, like in pain away from God. And that's what perish means. That's what the tradition says perish means here, that you are alienated or spiritually separated from God with an imperishable body and soul lurking behind the scenes. Can you see how mixed it's got? Because the Greek view, and this is what we'll talk about next week, the Greek view of the eternal soul, imperishable soul, got mixed with Christian theology. And then you had this backdrop to make hell possible. Okay, so, but to go back to what you're saying, yes, the plain language is the destiny is to perish. Yeah.
And that's the whole view of John's gospel.
Yeah, I mean, John does cause some problems, though, and I would say that John has a different view of some things to the synoptics. He does seem to use death and life in a very high and lofty, almost mystical sense sometimes. You're in death, but you're in life, and Jesus does seem like a bit of a mystic in John, and he seems to also talk about being born from above, and he doesn't seem to have this apocalyptic end of the world kind of scenario in any detail at all. Like the future judgment is coming. It's almost like you have passed from death to life. This has enabled, say, the tradition to say, aha, you see, death means that you can be alive when you're in death. And so they argue that, when you go to hell, you're in death whilst you're alive. And so you're immortal, but you're in death. And then the Christians are immortal, but they're in life. And so that John has actually contributed to the tradition in that way. And so I would say it's a little more complex, because that's where a lot of traditionalists actually use John. That may have surprised you then, Ed. They don't use a lot of traditionalists use John because they use it to make the case that if we've already passed from death to life, then all the non-Christians out there are in death. But I can see them moving around. They're animated, lively, living, but they're in death. So they say that's what hell is, you see. It's death whilst you're living. And so that is the objection, and that's how John is used. So I'd say John does make it more complicated because he does use death and life in that way. But I still think that John thinks that ultimately the people that are in spiritual death are like dead branches. And what happens to dead branches in John? They're thrown into the fire and burnt up, John 15. So you could argue that spiritual death just simply precedes the final destruction of those. And, the world is passing away, but you endure forever. The Christians endure forever. So I think that's probably what John is really referring to, in my humble opinion.
Okay, before we sign off, shall we just mention a little bit of homework? People would get a lot from reading Bart Ehrman's new book, published this March in hardback. So maybe we wait for the paperback. And it is called Heaven, Hell, Afterlife.
Is it on Kindle? Is it on Kindle?
Yes, it's on Kindle and on Audible. I have it on Audible. And
right. Yeah, I must get it. I'll try and get it on Audible.
The one major thing I learned from this is because I've changed since all of my studies years ago on this. I would have just tried to compatibilize Luke 16, Lazarus and Dives into a scenario how I put it. It's not about the ultimate judgment. It's about the immediate afterlife. It's probably not literal, but I had never by then got to the stage where I thought Jesus didn't actually say some things. And it makes a lot more sense to think that this was a later view of the gospel writer of Luke who put that story onto Jesus' lips because he had a view of that kind of afterlife. That's possible. And that Jesus never said it. If Jesus had heard that story, he goes, well, I don't believe that, And so that's when you get more into critical scholarship as opposed to just the average Bible believer who's not going to take that line. But that's the one major thing I felt I learned from his book. I thought, wow, that really makes sense, and I was really gleaning on that chapter about that Luke 16. So we had a hell of a time. I hope you have, Francis.
Yeah.
Yes. Not been too hot for you there. And, I don't know where cold as hell. Have you heard it'd be as cold as hell? Because that's said as well, isn't it?
That's said in what's it called? Rocket Man by
Elton John song.
Mars ain't the kind of place to raise your kids. In fact, it's cold as hell.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because hell is fire, hell is darkness as well. And so fire and darkness.
Well, freezing over is
hell freezing over, that's right.
Or snowballs chance in hell. I mean, normally the things are indicating that hell is extraordinarily hot. But
yes, but it's interesting how you've got that Cold as
Yeah.
hell. Yeah, because I thought that. Hell is darkness as well, of course, in the New Testament. I think we'll go a little bit. We'll start next time probably by talking about some of the other New Testament passages, and then get right into Paul, and then the big one, which is Revelation. And by the way, the traditional view kind of hangs its foundation basically in the book of Revelation. Ironically, it's one of the most hardest to understand books in the Bible, which is fascinating right there. And then we'll talk about the early church. We'll talk about universalism. We'll talk about some of the terms, church history, and get right up to today where we are with hell. So
and beyond.
And beyond. To hell and beyond.
So we're not going to have a whole lot of Christmas cheer and Christmas spirit then for our next one.
We're not really. So we don't want to make it more of a hell than it normally is at Christmas for some people. But if you want to tune in and find out more about hell, tune in 1 month's time.
Like for everyone else, Christmas is cancelled this year.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, until next time, hope you come back and join this for more. I have been Andrew, your host.
And I've been Frances.
And I'm Ed. Cheers.